Welcome to the Bill Seng Podcast. My name is Bill Seng, and past couple of episodes we've been on a little bit of a series talking about things that go bump in the night as it relates to the Bible, in fact. And the past few episodes we talked about the fall of mankind in the Garden of Eden, the serpent that may or may not have been a dragon. I guess if you think about it in terms of the serpents used to not crawl on their bellies in one form or another, that perhaps they had legs. Yeah, that would, if you get a serpent, a snake that's big enough with legs, that's definitely a dragon for sure. So, we talked about dragons in a very broad sense last time, in terms of physical dragons, which we would call dinosaurs, but then also in terms of spiritual dragons, which may entail things like the seraphim, which some think may have had reptilian, serpentine sort of features and are the highest class of angel. And some people have suggested perhaps Satan was a seraph. And there are things inside the Bible that may conflict with that idea. I still find it very compelling. Not saying I absolutely buy into it or totally disregard it either. I think it's a very compelling idea. But I also see that if I were to accept that reality, it would change the way that I look at certain parts of the Bible for sure. And it would change the way that you look at certain parts of the Bible as well. Now, where I want to go is the foundation for all things that are paranormal, strange, unusual, even cryptids and things like that in the world that we live in today, but taking the biblical foundation. Because yes, we had the fall. The serpent's creepy. Satan is creepy. We know those things. They're scary things. But where everything in our world seems to have its origins, in terms of the current state of the world today, would be in Genesis chapter 6. And it's fascinating because that's also where the world we have today has its scientific origins. Because people like myself believe that the world and its processes changed drastically after the worldwide flood that is foretold in Genesis chapter 6 of the Bible. And so, because of that, we also have to consider what other things could have changed as a result of this worldwide flood. And one of the things would be also how the supernatural realm interacts with humanity today. Genesis 6 is very fascinating because not only does it tell us about the flood, it also tells us about this very bizarre thing that happened in the world leading up to the flood. And in Genesis chapter 6, it reads, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. And they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for his flesh, his days shall be forever, but for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." Now, I, in some respects, was forced into a deep dive into the topic of the Nephilim not too long ago, and just further solidified my stance as far as what I believe that this passage is talking about. And it's got a couple of different parts to it. The first thing it says is that the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And there are two camps here. One camp says that the sons of God refer to the descendants of Adam through his son Seth and Enosh. And that those would be the sons of God because they're obedient to God. And then the daughters of man would be the female descendants of Cain. and so intermarrying. And we do see themes of this throughout the Old Testament, and it normally has negative results, bad results that lead the people of God astray. Now, this was not a common perspective of the understanding of this passage until way later in history. Probably ballpark of 1,000 years after this was written was when that started becoming a popular theory. Before then, almost everybody unanimously agreed that what this passage is talking about with the sons of God is actually fallen angels. Angels came down from heaven, from their heavenly dwelling, and took human wives for themselves. And then it goes on to say, first of all, we see that the Lord says, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years." And so we see that God is displeased by that. And then verse 4 says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." Now, in the King James Version, we see that Nephilim is translated as giants. And that is one of the ways to translate the Greek word for Nephilim. Nephilim is the actual Hebrew word. It's the plural for the word Nephil, which is talking about, it's actually a very hard to translate word. Nephil, if I'm not mistaken, partly could mean fallen ones, but also has some other affiliations that it has with other Hebrew words that's very, very fascinating, that alludes to the idea that these very well may have been hybrid human-angel hybrids. And so the offspring of the sons of God with the daughters of men were thought to be these half-human, half-angelic hybrids, which essentially would have been demonic in many regards. And it says that they're on the earth in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of man and they bore children to them. Okay, so it's making it clear that the Nephilim were the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of man. And it says, "These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." And again, this is going back, referring to the Nephilim. Now, the Nephilim are fairly popular even outside of Christian culture. Cults lots of times grab on to the Nephilim, as well as other people. I mean, and when we think about the Nephilim, what we got to consider in relation to them, the reality of the Nephilim, of the interbreeding of angelic beings with human beings to create these strange hybrids. We see it all throughout mythology, and I'm actually running out of time here, so I'm going to cut it short here, but we see it with the intermarrying of the gods of pagan religions with human beings, of having offspring with them, and then having these heroes like Hercules and such that are gifted with what appears to be this supernatural strength or supernatural abilities of different sorts that give them an edge over their plain human counterparts. And so we see this is rooted in Genesis chapter 6. Now, I'm going to get more into the idea of the Nephilim and the giants in the next episode of the Bill Seng Podcast, because it takes us into some very, very strange directions, which I think are necessary to investigate. So, for the time being, let it be known that the Nephilim are spoken of inside of the Bible, and that it is probably most likely that what the Nephilim weren't just these mighty men that were born of the intermarrying of Seth's children with Cain's children, but rather in the offspring of the marrying of angelic beings with human wives, and that bred these hybrid human angelic creatures that have an awful lot of lore behind them inside of the world that we live today. And we will get that, like I said, in the next episode. So thank you for joining me for this episode of the Bill Seng Podcast. Be blessed.